All right.
Um,
Yes, ma'am.
Jeff,
Yes, ma'am.
I do have one thing that I forgot to mention. Clyde Some Tyler is safely home from Japan.
Awesome.
He is back in Alaska with his wife and little boy.
Good deal.
So I forgot to mention that, but that happened, I think, Monday. So just praising the Lord that he's back because he'll be a lot happier where he is.
All right. Good deal. All right. We are continuing with our story of Elijah. And just as a little refresher, who was Elijah? Elijah, we don't know much about his background. He was from Tishbe, the Tishbite from Tishbe. In Tishbe, we talked about last week when we talked about the introduction to Elijah was it's a word that simply means of the settlers. He was one of the settlers. Some of the commentaries talk about this means that um, it means from the captives or the ones who settled the land after their uh, escape from Egypt, and then they crossed the Jordan River and kicked out the inhabitants, and then they settled the land. Regardless, he was from the northern part of what we consider the nation of Israel. Now, not that far from the Sea of Galilee, not that far from Nazareth. So he was from that portion of the nation of Israel that went with the 10 tribes who rebelled against Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and created their own kingdom. If you'll recall, we talked about that after Solomon, because of Solomon's sin, then his son made a mistake, and God removed part of the kingdom from him, the 10 northern tribes. Every tribe except Judah and Benjamin left and rebelled and formed their own nation, which we're going to talk about. The northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, took the name Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and the two southern tribes, of the two that remained faithful to Solomon's son, took the name of the kingdom of Judah. So now we have two nations. We have Judah and Israel. However, even though God is the one who allowed it to happen, and we could even say prompted it to happen because of Solomon's sin, that does not negate his overall purpose for the nation of Israel. They still, all 12 tribes, will serve his purpose and come back together um, later, as we will see much later. But Elijah introduces us, takes us from the focus on the kings, because there are very few godly kings during the period that we're talking about. But it takes us from focusing on the kings of Israel, Saul and David and Solomon and Rehoboam and those, to focusing on the prophets, who will be the predominant theme throughout the rest of the Old Testament. We'll talk about the prophets when we get into the minor prophets and the major prophets and all of those things, but it is the prophets that God raises up that take center stage from here on out after the raising up of Elijah and Elisha. So we will deal with Elijah and Elisha, and then we will deal with the rest of the prophets as we come to them. And if you'll recall what we talked about in chapter 17, Elijah comes onto the scene because King Ahab, is a wicked king of the 10 tribes of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and he marries Jezebel, and she's from Phoenicia. She's a Phoenician, and the Phoenicians worship Baal and the Asherah, and she perverts Ahab, and she is, we see later in the story that she is a domineering wife to Ahab, and Ahab just goes along to get along and allows her to do what she's going to do. And what she chooses to do is she persecutes the prophets of God, of the real God, of true God, of Jehovah, and lifts up the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. So that's where we find ourselves when Elijah comes on the scene. And Elijah comes on the scene and he brings a word from God and he tells Ahab that it is not going to rain until Elijah allows it to rain, until Elijah says it's going to rain. He brings a word from Jehovah, and it is to show Ahab, but more than that, it is to show the entire nation, the 10 tribes of Israel, that Jehovah is God and Baal is not. It's setting up what happens in chapter 18. But in the meantime, we see that that Elijah brings this prophecy from God of a drought, and then God tells him to go hide in the wilderness, and God miraculously through the ravens feeds him in the morning and in the evening. And then when the brook dried up and there's no more water for Elijah, God has prepared the heart of the widow of Zarephath for Elijah to come and live with her. And Zarephath, we talked about last week, was right in the shadow of where Baal was born. The thought of Baal, the false worship of Baal was born, and as a matter of fact, from Jezebel's hometown. So he is hiding out in the midst of where the enemy is. He's hiding out in enemy territory, and we see that God has prepared this widow, and we have the miraculous continuation of the oil and the flour in her jars, and then Elijah is allowed to bring life back to her dead son. So that brings us to what we're going to talk about in chapter 18. So anybody have any questions about the recap and what we talked about last week with Elijah? No follow-on questions, no nothing. I'm going to believe you. All right. Chapter 18. After many days, we see later, it is 3.5 years. So the drought is lasting 3.5 years. Does anybody else know what is going to last 3.5 years? Remember, things in the Bible are not there just willy-nilly. They all mean something.
The tribulation?
The Great Tribulation. Half of the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation period is divided up into two periods. Tribulation and the Great Tribulation. So the Great Tribulation is when God brings the immensity of his wrath down upon the nation of Israel and judges them, and then more than that, he brings the immensity of his wrath against all of the nations. So it's when the great wrath of God is poured out. It's called the Great Tribulation, and it ends with the second coming of Christ. So when we see that this drought is going to last 3.5 years, we immediately need to see, to remind ourselves, this is prophetic of something. This is a shadow or a forerunner or a teaching tool, if you will, of something of a greater reality, if that makes sense. Everything in the scripture is there to show us a shadow of what is to come. So what do we know about the tribulation period? What causes the great tribulation? The last 3.5 years of the tribulation period, when we look through the book of Revelation, is triggered by an event. Does anybody recall what the event is that triggers the last 3.5 years of the tribulation? What we call the Great Tribulation. It's when the Antichrist repudiates the peace treaty he has made with the nation of Israel, and demands and sets a image up in the rebuilt temple of God and demands worship as if he is God. So it's the moment in that 7-year time period when the Antichrist is no longer satisfied with allowing the Jewish people to acknowledge Yahweh as God and demands that they worship him and him alone. And that kicks off the Great Tribulation period. So this is all prefigured for us in the story of Elijah. What brings Elijah on the scene? What brings Elijah on the scene is that the nation of Israel, and again, we're talking about the 10 northern tribes, the nation of Israel has begun to leave the worship of Yahweh and migrate to the worship of Baal. so far at this point, they're trying to ride the fence. They still believe in Yahweh, but they want to add Baal to the mix. They want to add Asherah to the mix, right? They want to be like the world, and they want to go worldly and chase the gods of the world, and they just want to make Yahweh or Jehovah. If you Let's clarify that. Some people call it his name Yahweh. Some people call his name Jehovah. We don't know which is correct. They are both attempts in English to identify the God of the Israelites. Because if you're not familiar with our language of Hebrews, there are no vowels in Hebrew. It's only consonants. And so we have what's called the Tetragrammaton, which the Tetragrammaton are the four consonants that make up the name of God, right? And so in Hebrew also there is no J, and the Y produces a J sound. So that's why some people say Jehovah, some people say Yahweh, because we don't know what vowels to insert between those the consonants in the Hebrew language, because the Hebrew people, they were so afraid of taking God's name in vain, the proper pronunciation of it has been lost to history. So either or, Yahweh or Jehovah are both are referring to the God that we worship, the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Israelites, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So does that make sense? So I prefer Yahweh, but I don't know why, I just do. But Jehovah and Yahweh are in English attempts to identify and speak about the same God. So they're interchangeable, in other words. All right. So I said all that to say that we see the story of Elijah. It prefigures much of what's going to happen later in history, as we'd see through many of the prophets. Some of the prophets are prophesying to the nation of Israel, but many of them specifically, well, for instance, the prophet Isaiah has been called the fifth gospel, because the prophet Isaiah gives us a prophecy about the Messiah's first coming. It describes the Messiah as the suffering servant. It describes the Messiah as the branch, and all of those things, which we'll go through when we get to Isaiah. But then we have Ezekiel and we have Daniel, who are describing the second coming of the Messiah. Right? So the prophets all ultimately point to things that are going to happen. And that is what Elijah is also allowed to do, albeit a little more obscure, and it takes a little more searching than the others. But we see that in the 3.5 years, and we see that the nation of Israel is chasing after another God, and this is a crisis point in their relationship with Yahweh. This is a time where they have to make a decision, and that's what Elijah has been sent on the scene to force the nation into doing. So, all of that being said, let's get into chapter 18. After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. This is not more than likely the same Obadiah as we'll read about the prophet Obadiah, one of the minor prophets. Some commentators try to force the two to make one, but the Obadiah who writes the book of Obadiah is probably a contemporary of Jeremiah and Daniel, but Obadiah means the servant of Jehovah. But we don't know exactly who he is. We don't know where he's from. But other than the fact that he is over the household of Ahab. So he's a government official, a high government official. That's all we know about it. Except that he was a believer in Yahweh. And Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, and when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, which means she killed them, When Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by fifties in a cave and fed them with bread and water. So Obadiah takes it upon himself to save 100 prophets of God, and he hides them from Jezebel. And Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the valleys. Perhaps we may find grass and save the horses and mules alive, and not lose some of the animals." So they divided the land between them to pass through it. Ahab went in one direction by himself, and Obadiah went in the other direction by himself. So the drought has come. There's been no rain, and obviously if you have no rain, you have no growth of the plant life, and they're having a hard time to find forage for the animals. And so they're going to go search through the land to see if they can find some valleys or some areas that the grass is still growing, they can send and feed their flocks at. So they split up between them, and one goes one way, one goes the other. Verse 7, and as Obadiah was on the way, behold, Elijah met him. And Obadiah recognized him and fell on his face and said, "Is it you, my lord Elijah?" And he answered him, "It is I. Go, tell your lord, behold, Elijah is here." And he said, "How have I sinned that you would give your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my Lord has not sent to seek you. And when they would say he is not here, he would take an oath of the kingdom or nation that they had not found you. And now you say, go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here." So apparently Ahab has been looking for Elijah this entire 3.5 years, and he's looked everywhere he can think of. He just fails to understand that maybe he should look in Jezebel's hometown. And as soon as I have gone from you, verse 12, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you, I know not where. And so when I come and tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, he will kill me. Although I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. Has it not been told, my Lord, that what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord? How I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by fifties in a cave and fed them with bread and water? And now you say, go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here, and he will kill me. And Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So not only is Jezebel killing the prophets, the prophets of the true God, she is using the government, she is supporting them out of the tax dollars, if you will. They're 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah. They were eating at the king's table, which means that the king was paying their salary, and they were living on the largesse of the king. So she has made the Baal and Asherah the official religion, if you will, of the northern kingdom of Israel. And so Elijah says, have them meet me at Mount Carmel, along with all of Israel. So he starts giving orders to the king, as well he should. And we also see that he says that he has not troubled Israel, but he puts the onus back on Ahab and Ahab's family, because they have chased after false gods. That is why that God has sent the drought. It's not Elijah troubling Israel because he wants to. It's Elijah being a spokesman for God, and the trouble from Israel actually comes from Ahab's own behavior. But nevertheless, Ahab does what Elijah commands him to do. So now we get into the famous part of this story. Any questions so far? Comment? Am I going too fast, going too slow? All right, Mount Carmel. A couple of things we need to understand about Mount Carmel, and why does God have Elijah pick Mount Carmel? Mount Carmel is a long a long ridge, if you will. It's got some rounded promontories on it. It was very lush, so it was associated with fertility, but it also, where it's at, it ends, the eastern end of it is at the Jezreel Valley, the western end of it is near the Mediterranean Sea, so it channeled a lot of storms that would arise off the Mediterranean, and there would be a whole lot of thunderstorms associated with Mount Carmel. And because of the thunderstorms, if you recall what we talked about Baal, Baal was the god of the storms, they believed. And they believed that when the lightning and the thunder came on Mount Carmel, it was Baal's doing, it was Baal speaking, in other words. They attributed it to Baal, so Mount Carmel was, to the Phoenicians and those who worshiped Baal, it was a holy place. They would worship Baal on top of Mount Carmel. Also, I mentioned that Mount Carmel was famed for its fertility, and Asherah was a fertility goddess, and so Mount Carmel was associated with both of the false gods that Elijah has been sent to defeat. So it also straddled the border between Phoenicia and the nation of Israel. So it was on the border between the two, so it was sort of neutral, but it was, if you would look at it this way, Elijah is going into enemy territory. He is going to the mountain that was associated with Baal and Asherah, and has those prophets meet him there on that mountain. So verse 20, so Ahab sent to all the peoples of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people answered, it is well spoken. Elijah gives them this challenge on Mount Carmel. Here, we're in your home territory. You get ready. You make this offering ready to Baal. And I'll make an offering ready to Jehovah. And we'll call upon the Lord and see which one of them really is in charge of the lightning. That's in essence what he said. They believed all this time, they attributed the lightning that would be coming with the thunderstorms there on Mount Carmel to their god Baal. They attributed that lightning to him. They said he was in charge of the lightning, and he was bringing the lightning and the storms and the rain. And so Elijah said, okay, let's both prepare an offering, and we'll see which God is in charge of the lightning. We'll see which God will bring fire down from heaven. And that people said, okay, sounds like a great idea. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourself 1 bull and prepare it first. For you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. So Elijah, in essence, says, you know what? He's not a real God. He might be in the bathroom. You better holler for him. Harder, louder. He might be asleep. In essence, your God is worthless, right? He's not a God. He's doing human things. You're calling on somebody who is not a God. Verse 28, and they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out upon them. Leviticus 19, I think 19, 20 something, where the law forbids people to cut themselves, and the famous one, or tattoo themselves, and that worries a lot of people who have already got tattoos. But if you read it in context, and what we see here was that in ancient Semitic people that false worship of false gods was often accompanied by cutting themselves, which was thought to bring the sympathy of the god upon themselves, upon the people who cut themselves, or they were to mark themselves with tattoos that would symbolize that they belong to that god, and the god would have sympathy on them because they had dedicated themselves to him. So it is not talking about your butterfly on your ankle, right? This is talking about tattooing yourself as in a means of marking yourself as a follower of a false god, and cutting themselves was a sign that you were willing to shed blood for that god, and supposedly that would bring his sympathy to them. We still see that happening over there in that for some of the Muslim groups. One of the Muslim groups, they do that. There's a festival where they take and cut themselves up, and you can Google it, and you see them all bloody, and they think that is bringing pleasure to their God. And when in the law of Jehovah it is forbidden to do that, but this is what these priests of Baal decide to do. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, 3 o'clock. The offering of the oblation, if you go back and read the law of Moses, we see that every day at 3 o'clock the nation was to offer a offering that it was more than a friendship offering. Oblation means that you are dedicating something to God. So the daily 3 o'clock oblation offering was the fact that they were admitting and remembering and reminding themselves that they had been dedicated as God's holy people, that they had been chosen by God, that they belonged to Jehovah. That happened every day at 3 o'clock. There's something else that happened at 3 o'clock. If anybody recalls, what time was the Passover lamb to be slaughtered? At the same time as the offering of oblation, 3 o'clock, right? So we see that when Jesus is on the cross, if you look at the timeline, what time does he bow his head and give up his spirit? When he says, "It is finished, and Father, into my hands I commit your spirit," it happened at 3 o'clock. So not only is Jesus symbolizing the Passover lamb, which he was because he was crucified on Passover, he is also fulfilling the oblation, the daily oblation offering that also happened at 3 o'clock. So 3 o'clock, they do all of this to 3 o'clock, and nothing has happened. As the midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, and there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. So there was no God there to hear them, in other words. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me," and all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." So, remember, Elijah has been sent to the 10 northern tribes, but he is recognizing and prophesying and teaching that the 10 northern tribes and 2 southern tribes are still one people. They have been chosen by God, and God has not finished with them as one singular nation yet. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. About 4 gallons or so, 7 quarts, 7 point some quarts. So, yeah, about 4 gallons. The trench around the altar would contain about 4 gallons. And he put the wood in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. What's 3 times 4? It's 12. You didn't think I knew math, did you, Terry? I could see you looking at me. All right. So the water also symbolizes the 12 tribes of Israel. So he had them pour 12 buckets of water on the altar, on the wood, on the offering, and the water ran around. In verse 35, the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known, and that's very specific. Why he says it this way? Because typically it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, here Elijah wants to make the point that yes, he is the God of Jacob, but Jacob's name was changed to Israel because it was the 12 tribes of Israel would signify the nation. So he wants him to understand it's not just the 10 tribes, it's the 12 tribes of Israel. O God, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that the people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. The river Kishon, or the brook Kishon, is right at the end of the Mount Carmel on the eastern end. So he takes them over to the land of Israel and slaughters them there. And Elijah said to Ahab, Go up, eat, and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing of rain. So Elijah tells Ahab, Go and celebrate. Go and celebrate. God is going to bring the rain. So Ahab went up to eat and drink. And Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel, and he bowed himself down on the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, Go up now, look toward the sea. And when he went up and looked and said, There is nothing. And he said, Go again, 7 times. And at the 7th time he said, Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea. And he said, Go up, say to Ahab, Prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you. And in a little while the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment, and he ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Jezreel was about 10-15 miles from the traditional site where this happened on Mount Carmel. It could be as far as 20 miles, we don't know. But God supernaturally allowed Elijah to beat Ahab to the gates or the entrance of the town of Jezreel. And then we will see what happens in chapter 19 next week after that. But do we have any comments, questions, concerns about the confrontation between the prophets of Baal and the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel? It was to remind the children of Israel, but more than just the 10 tribes of the nation of Israel, it was to remind all 12 tribes that Jehovah was God, and that he was the one who was in charge, and he was the only God, that Baal was nothing. The prophets of Baal could do nothing. There was no one to listen to their cries. And it just took Elijah, a simple prayer to Jehovah or Yahweh, and God not only consumed the burnt offering, he consumed the altar, he consumed the dust, the dirt, the water, everything, to show them that he was in charge of it all. So, comments, questions, concerns?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
And the part where it's talking about God sending the rain, Elijah says at the very beginning in verse 41 that there was a sound of the rushing rain. And then later he talks about going to the sea and looking. Why is there a sound of rain before going to see the cloud?
I don't know if that is a euphemism or if it is a. I would have to dig into the Hebrew behind that. It may be an idiom. It may be any number of ways to communicate that the rain is surely coming. Right? Because I mean, yeah, you're looking at it. He sends his servant 7 times to go look for a cloud, and you would think, in the normal course of events, that until there is a storm cloud, there's no sound of a storm. Right? So my guess, and that's all it is right now. I'll do some research and get back to you. But my guess, because it's not something that's ever crossed my mind, that question, to be honest with you. But my guess is it's a Jewish idiom that talks about the surety of the rain that will come. That the rain is coming, you can count on it, so just go ahead and celebrate it. That's just a guess, though, Tracy. I'll have to get back with you.
Okay, I guess I'm just weird thinking that question then.
Do what?
I said, I guess I'm just weird thinking that
No,
question then.
you're not weird. That's just, and the honest truth is, every time I read the scripture, I see something in there and I say to myself, well, when did they put that there? I don't remember that. When did that show up? So that's just, that's something now that I'm thinking about it. That's interesting. I need to know the answer to that. But God had never prompted me to to look into that before. But now He is, so I will look into that. Anything else? Does anybody know what today is? Besides October 1st, I know that.
Government shutdown.
Government shutdown, I know that too.